I felt like it was fitting to have you finish up because your book was a culmination of a lot of the conversations that we had during the week. I know you ventured to Australia to really dig into the stacks, if you will, and do research, talking to Russell McKinnon yesterday about your visit. But for starters, just tell me, for you, what was the impetus to kind of write this book, and why was it so important to chronicle what Sydney 2000 has meant?
I had the opportunity to be around that team. Actually, the team before, the Perth team in 1998, was the first time I traveled I was in your position, the media director for USA Water Polo. So I got to know the team there in Perth in 1998, and what a change between 98 and 2000 that occurred. So I was with the team in 1999 when they went to the World Cup in Winnipeg and failed to qualify. And things were looking pretty bleak at that point. And then again in 2000 in the spring, April, going to Palermo, where they, beat Hungary. And what an amazing victory that was. It changed, it changed the course of women's water polo in our country. And part of the thinking of this book is this is the ultimate underdog story. This team wasn't expected to qualify. They weren't expected to medal. But as the players this week have said, and Russell and Guy, once we got to that tournament, it was anybody's tournament, anybody's game that day. And so I look at this team as kind of the bridge between generations, between that pre-Olympic generation where the World Championships was their ultimate goal and what we see today. And really thinking, for people who've joined USA Water Polo and into the girls' side, the women's side, what we know is that we are the Olympic champions since 2012 and winning at all levels. It's been amazing, incredible program. But I thought it was very interesting to go back and see how did this start?
And I love that term bridge. It was used a lot this week. Brenda talked about it, how they really talked about it being able, they felt like they were the physical bridges in the water, right? Playing with that pre-Olympic era and then going into the current. You bring up a great point. It's something that, not to beat a dead horse, but I really tried this week to want to give context to the current generation. If you follow women's water polo now, not only do you think that the U.S. is going to win every gold medal, but you have no doubts that they should even be in the Olympic Games. Can you give a little bit of context of what the feeling was like, the excitement around just having a chance to have your sport represented at the Olympic level?
Yeah, I think, a couple of facts about water polo as an Olympic sport. Many people know it was the first team sport in 1900, men's water polo. 100 years later, we had the women debut. In between, there was women's water polo, but really only 4 major nations were playing women's water polo. So there were reasons, and people stood up to that challenge to grow women's water polo internationally. But getting it onto that stage means everything to, the women who played before, the girls and women who played before. A big part of what I really got into thinking about was we had so many stars in our country, water polo women stars, who never had that chance. And, you think about multiple time world championship players, members, they would have been multiple time Olympians. They played the sport at the highest level there was. And I think it meant a lot to them especially to see Mo O'Toole carry that on into the Olympic Games. And what an amazing story for her to come out of retirement. And she retired basically thinking this will never happen. Women's water polo will not be an Olympic sport. So, a great accomplishment for everyone who was involved.
We're talking with Kyle Utsumi, a longtime water polo coach and author of Sydney's Silver Linings. And you mentioned the Maureen O'Toole story. We talked to her this week. 17 years old, joins the national team in the late 70s, comes out of retirement as a 36-year-old, plays in the Olympics as a 39-year-old, stuff that just doesn't happen today in women's water polo. I was curious about what you just hit on. There had to be some bittersweet feelings, and I think Mo talked about it a bit. Initially hearing that water polo was going to be added to the Olympics and almost laughing it off, like, well, of course, now that I'm retired, now they added. But for those women that weren't able to unretire or it had been too many years, was it a bittersweet moment? Was there, of course, happiness that the sport that they had played so long, finally got added, but there had to be frustration that, they unfortunately missed their window.
Yeah, one of the great stories in the book, and it really, was Lynn Whitstock was the captain of the team for many years, and she retired after, or she came, wanted to keep trying to make that Olympic team when it was named. She went to the first training session, and after that made the decision, it's not right. It's her body's broken down. She had a full-time job. This would be the first time that the women's program would go into full-time training. So there were lots of, considerations to make, as, in the previous generation, these women had full-time jobs. They paid their, they fundraised, paid their own way. So from that standpoint, I think it is tough to see, wow, now they're getting all these things. But Lynn's story in the book is really one of gratitude. And she understood, to hold on and try to keep going is taking someone's spot who is really going to be the future of this team. And I thought that was fantastic.
We had talked all week about the qualification process, and you outlined that it was a dicey situation, to put it mildly, right? As the U.S. team is trying to figure out their way in to qualify after a couple of opportunities. And we mentioned this with the Australians as well. From being around the U.S. team, what do you remember as far as the pressure to qualify? Everyone so badly wants this opportunity. You get the chance now, your sport is in the Olympics, but then you have to go out and punch the ticket.
Yeah, I mean, we're coming off an 8th place finish in the 1998 World Championships. So the next major trend, that championship happened in January. So there's a long stretch of time before the first qualification attempt in Winnipeg at the World Cup. But, we're, as an American sports federation, we want to be in the Olympics. And here it is. Here's the chance. We've been one of the top nations since the beginning of women's water polo, and had, fallen back a little bit to that 8th place finish. It was a big transition time. So with Guy Baker's program, some new players, some old players, that Winnipeg World Cup was, it felt awful. Especially, it came down to a head-to-head match with Canada. The winner of it was actually the highest finisher from the Americas would get the bid, and so that match, didn't go our way, and it was viewed as the easiest way, the smoothest path to the Olympics, because what would happen next is an Olympic qualification tournament where in Europe, and we'd have to face world champion Italy, perhaps Hungary, to make it. And there were only going to be 2 spots, most likely, as long as the Asian team took their spot, which they did.
And the U.S. would, of course, go on, take the road less traveled, as it were, but they're able to go and qualify. Even today, as much success as the women's program has had, from a media standpoint, and the role that you had and the role we all know well here in this conversation, you're still trying to educate folks about this sport and how great this team is, and why water polo should be covered. If you think back to your time in 99, 2000, the team qualifies. There's going to be a U.S. women's water polo team in the Olympic Games. What's that process like for you to get people now to know what this is and why it's important?
A big thing was that girls water polo was exploding at the time. And one of the neat stories about this, I think, we think about organizations building up in a grassroots fashion from the bottom up. The story of women's water polo in the United States is really a story from top down. Mm-hmm. And so we get this Olympic status in 1997, late 1997. Well, NCAA followed briefly after, the first championship was, set for 2001, but that was in the works. If you're going to have collegiate varsity teams and an NCAA championship, you need high school teams. And if the high school teams are there, you need age group teams. So coaches, programs all over the country were, it was that top down. We have this, so we need to build up from the ground. So I thought that was, the audience was there, and so many of the coaches were so quick to bring on the girls game. And that was really important. I think in 1996, there were 18 entries in the it was 13 and under at the time, the 14 under division, 18 entries at JOs. 2016, when this book came out, Rio Olympics, there were over 100 girls teams in the 10, 12, and 14 and under age groups. And more this year, if we had, at Junior Olympics 2020, would be bigger. This is only getting bigger. And so the impact is incalculable.
Guy told a story, and he's told it before, about the roster size for the Olympics, and it's one of the great stories from that era of the roster being 11 and then getting moved to 13. Previous competition had been a 13-woman roster, and so lots of trepidation about, well, we knew our 13 players, now what do we do for the Olympics? We've been around the situation before, right, where you're at practice and there's more players than there are roster spots, and the nerves and the anxiety around that. What do you remember about the conversation where 2 extra spots get added and just maybe that breaking a little bit of the attention? There's still an extra spot or an extra player that's not going to make it, but how did the team react to that in your memory?
Yeah, it's a tough thing. In most sports, you're allowed to carry a roster that's at least enough to scrimmage, to play practice, right? In water polo, even at 13, we have, less than you're able to scrimmage in preparation when you're at a tournament. So you most of the time need to bring in an alternate. The one thing I would say about the 11 is women's water polo. So water polo in the Olympics with men's water polo, we were the only team sport without a women's complement. And, FINA said the equity was that there was synchronized swimming. So they counted that as the equity against men's water polo. So when we did get accepted in the Olympics, the women, it was 6 teams as opposed to 12 men, and they were going to have 11 players. And so these compromises, of course, to get the sport in, but, to have training where you don't know, and we needed, of course, more people at training, but you don't know if you're going to make that cut when you were on the team to qualify. So those 13 went to Palermo and they qualified the Olympic team. They put us in the Olympics. And then to think the 2 would not get to go, it lifted the spirits so high. And we're going. Now the team is going. And the mind shift, I'm sure, was, let's get this done. It was a really settling thing for them.
We're talking with Utsumi, author of Sydney's Silver Lining, and you bring up a great point about qualifying and then not actually making a team. And some Olympic fans might not realize this. It happens in a lot of sports. You can help earn your country's spot. It doesn't mean that you get to go. There are certain things where it's timed events and trials, and you set the time, and then you qualify. But other things like team sports, you can be part of the qualifying effort and never actually get a chance to become an Olympian. And so that is a very tenuous moment. So as you're building up towards Sydney, and thinking back to your research and what you learned for the book, what's something that you were living it, but I'm sure you uncovered things that maybe kind of surprised you, or things you just didn't know. What's something is in that lead up process to the Olympic Games, having water polo for the first time, you learned that maybe kind of surprised you or blew you away a little bit?
Well, 2 things. One is the composition of our team, and really getting to, these are all people I knew, the athletes, friends with them, but really getting into their stories. And Julie Swale put it this way. She said, this new era is fantastic. All these girls playing water polo, and we're at the top of the water polo world. But you'll never have another team like this, the Sydney team, the Bad News Bears, she called it. Because, it's amazing. We had Gubba Sheehy, who didn't play until college. We had players from New Mexico and from Utah, and Mo coming out of retirement, Brenda breaking barriers. A lot of these players played with boys growing. So there will not be another team, composed of this type of background. The other thing was, it was just really great to dig into the history of how did this happen. And there's a big chapter, it's long, chapter 4, that goes into what was this fight, who fought for this. And it was really people from all over the world. But one of the best interviews that I valued was going to Cronulla, a suburb of Sydney, and speaking with Pat Jones. I know Russell brought up her name right at the end of his Facebook yesterday. And Pat put a lot of things in motion, and she actually was instrumental in starting the Australian women's national team. And, digging into this history, you find that we played the Australians in the first national team match in Hawaii in 1976. And Pat was instrumental in bringing the Australian team there. We had clubs there, and they decided to pick all-stars to play against Australia after the nationals. So we've been linked with Australia. United States women's water polo, Australian women's water polo have been linked throughout the history of national team play. What a fitting final it came down to, and unexpected, but just the best situation we could have hoped for at the end.
Talking with Kyle Utsumi, and we've got a couple of comments here. We'll come back to this at the end. Of course, we want to plug where folks can get this, but just a quick note for those watching now, Kyle, where can people buy the book?
It's available on my website, sydneysilverlining.com, and also Amazon, online, the online booksellers.
Sydney's Silver Lining, so check it out. So much great stuff in there. So you're able to dig into the history. It is something that I think the modern day water polo fan knows. Well, it seems like at all the big events, the USA women and Australia meet up in important games. It's really been a theme from 2000 forward, where it's been World Championships, Olympic Games, that sort of thing. As we get into this very first Olympic Games competition, what do you remember about being on the ground in Sydney and just the excitement around the competition beginning? Russell was telling us yesterday, for good or for bad, ripped suits kind of drew people in, and then they stayed and enjoyed the competition. What was your memory of those opening games?
Well, I think I've been fortunate to go to Olympics in many different cities. Sydney was very special. The people there, and any Olympic city really, takes on the spirit of the games. But the Australians, I was fortunate. I lived there for about 2 months in the lead up, and they just couldn't wait. It was like an explosion when the games themselves just started. All the venues were full, and we were lucky. So we talk a lot about the 17,000 in the final. That was at Homebush in the swim stadium. But I think we were fortunate to have the smaller venue for our preliminary rounds, because it meant it was full. And it was such a great environment. Of course, the yellow and green wigs, those people cheer, and they've got their cheers, I think, that are probably universal in Australian sport. And, to see them come to water polo, and really, you knew that they weren't all water polo fans, but they were picking it up. They started cheering at all the right times, yelling at the refs at all the right times. I mean, it was just a real celebration.
And this U.S. women's team, again, to compare them to current day, they've been ranked #1 for a long time. To your point, though, they're coming off of an 8th place finish at the last major competition pre-Olympics outside of qualifiers. Julie Swale was telling the great story about Sports Illustrated, kind of everyone agreeing that Kazakhstan was in theory the 6th place team, but after that it was a bit of a toss-up. But U.S. was probably just right after Kazakhstan. What were the expectations? When media are there and they're saying this happens at every Olympics, the journalist that does not cover water polo says, "So we're going to win this thing? What's going to happen?" What was the expectation for that U.S. team as they start game one?
This is in that transition, and Guy Baker bringing his program, and you saw the effects, you saw the change. And it didn't happen right away. So that's the year 1999 as a whole. Of course, the failed attempt to qualify. But even as they finished that year in December with the Holiday Cup, just the results weren't coming. But like any long-term project, you have to give it time. The players stuck with it. Of course, the coaches stuck with it. And you start to see results in 2000. And you get to that qualifier, and in theory, on paper, well, Italy's going to qualify, Hungary's going to qualify, so where are we? And then we knock off Hungary in the semifinal to earn that spot. Russia knocks off Italy at home, in Italy, and you've got 2 teams, and there you go. We now know that we can beat anyone in the world. And one of the great stories that I remember from that, there was a first place game. Even though Russia and the United States qualified for the Olympics, there was still a championship game, and we lost. And I interviewed Guy after that, and it's like, "Hey, you guys are going to the Olympics." And well, we've got so much to work on. This game proves we're not ready. And you just know that the mindset was we'll be there, but we're not just showing up, to walk in the opening ceremonies. We're not going for the participation certificate. We're going to go win a medal, and that's what they did.
That competition gets underway, and as the U.S. progresses through, I think there's a loss in there to Australia, tie against Canada as they're working their way through. They get to the semifinals against the Netherlands, which is even today is still a good matchup. But trying to kind of quantify what it is for the U.S. to get past the Dutch in an Olympic Games final, based off of what the Netherlands had done, and I feel like in every interview I've drawn a parallel to this Michael Jordan documentary, only because it was so much on our minds. But it was reminiscent of kind of the Bulls getting past the Pistons, where it's like you have this established team. What was, give some context to that for the U.S. to defeat a team that had the history of the Netherlands in a game like that?
To beat them twice.
Yeah.
They opened the tournament with, what was shocking to others, but our team, that was, their mission was to win that game, that first game. So then, the Netherlands wasn't, first Olympic, match for everybody. Okay, we lost to the United States. We'll see them again. So they see us again in the semi. And, I think, as you said, you not only have to get over that hill once, but twice. And just a classic game. And, what the Netherlands team, veterans, if you look at their medal count, they were us. The Netherlands at 2000, that was us now. Where, well, of course they're going to be in the final of, okay, a couple silver medals, but it was, the Dutch were winning gold. And I think Russell said this, it might have been their, players that were on that team just at the end of their career. And that Olympics was that final thing to go to, that ultimate tournament. But we were that team in transition and on the rise. And, to see the emotions there, because, a 6-team tournament, the Dutch made it to the semis. Okay, the medal round, we will win a medal, and here they get knocked off. Now, I know Sophia said this week, the third place game, bronze medal game, is difficult. You have to get off the mat from losing that semi. But, the tie against Canada for us, did so much in that preliminary round to give us that more confidence. And here we are playing with, toe-to-toe with every team. And that semifinal came down to the wire.
You've been at the Olympic Games before, and we saw it in Beijing as well. You win a semifinal, and there's that sense of, okay, well, we're not leaving here empty-handed, right? You're going to get something. For that 2000 group, though, again, to kind of becoming a bit off the radar, the general perception from outside of the team is that this is an underdog group, as you kind of talked about the way they were formed. Is there a little bit of disbelief, like, wow, we are going to win a medal no matter what happens here? And then with that schedule being day after day, you have to immediately pivot and get ready to actually go try and win the gold.
Yeah, there's just so much joy and elation winning that semifinal. And what I remember from the next day, so the day of the final, being at the training session, they get 1 hour. The teams at international tournaments get 1 hour in the pool. And I was young in my coaching career, and I watched them and thought, well, what are you going to do at the practice before the gold medal game? And I was so impressed. They were so businesslike, but this lifted weight that they're going to get a medal, but they just ran through a couple plays, loosened up, smiles, chatting, and then they took off. And I had the feeling, they're ready for this. This is going to be fun tonight. And that night final with the crowd, unforgettable.
Yeah, hard to imagine an environment like that. The World Championships a couple of years ago in Budapest was pretty impressive with just a jammed crowd, but it wasn't 17,000 people to watch an Olympic final. Does that still go down as good as it gets for you when it comes to watching a water polo game?
Spending a lifetime in water polo, anything that legitimizes us as a sport like any other major sport it makes me really happy. So, to see that, to see crowds at our games, I think it was 2016 European Championship, that pool in Belgrade,
Yes.
18,000 they're calling it. So, perhaps a record there, but for the women, 1,000 easily still the record. And I'm fortunate to play lots of games at Avery Stadium at Stanford, and those NCAA championships with the crowd filled, and you can feel that noise, and that makes us, right up there with any major sporting experience. And so, that to me lifts our sport.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Avery Packed is probably the best experience you have now in the U.S. as far as being in a water polo facility when everything is just loud. And that's several thousand. It's crazy to think that multiplied by many. This whole week, we've of course have talked about the results. If you've been watching, this was a heartbreaking loss for the U.S. It's this final second. If you're a sports fan, it's as exciting as it gets. It's a buzzer beater. It's confusion. It's celebration. The agony of defeat. All of those things you hear about in sports. Certainly memorable. We've kind of heard the reaction from the players, the coaches, from kind of the media standpoint. What was the reaction to it? Did it elevate the sport because it was so frantic and exciting? Did that help in some way?
For those of us that know water polo, it was a little frustrating. How can that happen that way? On the other hand, like you said, maybe not the best way to get exposure, those suits ripping, but it brought this crowd of people who were there to enjoy this gold medal match but didn't know water polo. Just raised it another level. What's happening? What happened? And of course, majority Australian crowd, they loved the result. But yeah, it was confusing. It was that you'd like matches to just naturally, get to their conclusion, the crescendo, and it kind of paused. And so that pause was, I thought, no, they'll bring this back. And, I think our team obviously was thinking, we're going to overtime. Their huddle, they said at the side, had to do with, no, here's what we're doing. Here's how we're going to continue. And to get that news, it was just an up and down. It was a very up and down, maybe 20 minutes. When Brenda scored the goal, then there's this confusion. And then, at the end, you have a very happy stadium full of people, a happy team in the pool, and our women got on that podium to receive their medals. And, they represented themselves and our country so well.
Talking with Kyle Utsumi, author of Sydney's Silver Lining. You can get it at Kyle's website, sydneysilverlining.com, or on Amazon. Definitely recommend picking up this book. Great history of just one of the most pivotal moments in women's water polo and kind of the impact. Kyle, you mentioned you did these interviews in 2016. So that's 16 years later after these games. We're now 20 years later. You were there in Sydney. You talked to people there, and then you talked to them 16 years later. Was there a general sense of what perspective people had gained 16 years later? Was there a different reaction to things, after time had kind of settled in on how people felt about what went on in Sydney?
What I found most interesting, this may be how teams work, both the United States women and the Australian women, as they were chatting, they said, I would say, hey, this teammate said this. I said, we've never talked about that. There were so many things they hadn't really discussed and emotions that they hadn't discussed. And I sat at a table with 3 of the Australian gold medalists, and they would say something and the others would say, I never knew that. I didn't know that's how you were feeling. I didn't know that's what was going through your mind. So I think it was, I think the players appreciated that chance later to be asked about it, and not just in the, hey, I heard you won a medal in the Olympics, but what was this story behind this? And I found that fascinating. I think it gave everyone a chance to reflect.
Even 16 years later, was any of this too painful for some folks to kind of dive back into? Was and probably more on the U.S. side, having a loss like that, was it still that fresh in their minds to kind of recount what was a difficult loss despite a historic moment?
I think it varied. Some players and people will take things and carry on. in different ways. But for the most part, the experience was what mattered, and realizing their part in history, you know, to come together as this group, this unexpected group, the way they got to their position. And, you know, there's a lot of pride. So, you know, the result, of course, a second would have made a big difference, but their lifetimes, you know, I think they are very proud to have done this.
This was a highly ambitious project by you to take on. You did a fundraiser. You know, this wasn't, if you've seen in the movies, you know, Kyle didn't get some big advance from Random House to go out and write this book, and then it ended up, you know, over at Barnes and Nobles the next day. What's been the reaction? This was a passion project for you. You made it happen. Not many people do. What's been the reaction now that it's been out for a little while?
Well, thanks, Greg, for bringing that up. You know, there were 282 Kickstarter supporters, and so I want to thank those people. And we, you know, we raised money to bring this project to life. It's something I think that is important to our sport. It's, you know, it's one thing to be at the top of the water polo world, but I think, and I'm a history teacher, understanding where we came from, and understanding the people, the athletes, the administrators who made this happen. You know, we take for granted maybe that not only are we going to have results at the Olympics, but even that we're in the Olympics. And, you know, water polo will never be the top revenue sport. Sport in many ways dominated in Europe. And it's important that we spread water polo around the world so that we have that international Olympic motivation around the world. So I think this is a fun way for people to dive into the history. There's great stories. All the athletes have a story to tell. Got into the Australians, of course, the pioneers. It just was a real great project for myself.
No, and so and to your point, you know, obviously we have video footage of games and certain interviews, but it is important to have that, you know, kind of full picture of what went on. And the sport of water polo doesn't get a lot of those things. Doesn't get the full deep dive book treatment. Anything else before we let you go here? Anything else that, you know, came up that you included in the book, or maybe stuff that you just found interesting that didn't really have a home for the book, but you just thought it was a great story, or an anecdote, something else you'd want to share with folks?
You know, I think it's something that's so big for us now. What I would love is for this story to get out of the water polo community. And, you know, so the community received it so well. You know, I know in this time of being at home quite a bit, the sales have gone up a little bit. I've seen some numbers going up, you know, but it's a story that people would enjoy. We have Mo Toole, who was, you know, had Kelly was a young daughter. Brenda, Erica Lorenz, very young coming in. The sacrifices they all made. I think it's a story that resonates, you know, across sports and really across life.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. As you've done this, you know, and I feel like once you write something, someone's probably asked you, well, what's the next thing you're going to write? Is there other water polo story in the last 20 years, or something else in the sports, or another interest that has really piqued you that you'd like to give the same treatment to?
Yeah, you know, I'm originally from Fullerton, California, so shout out to Fullerton. But you know, something that's always intrigued me is Cal State Fullerton baseball.
Yeah,
and just why should they be so good over decades and decades? And really, the growth of Orange County. It's a story that could be told. So anyone out there who wants to finance that. There won't be a Kickstarter campaign in my future, but you know, there are stories in all sports, and The Last Dance was just fascinating. You know, there are stories underneath any team.
no, you're exactly right. You see the power of storytelling and what it could do. Maybe one of those Fullerton Titans that have gone into the major leagues can help finance this. And The Last Dance was evidence too of what storytelling can be. It's, you know, there's probably not the footage of everything that went on in the lead up to 2000 to tell it as completely visually, but that would be fascinating. You know, I thought that group and just the journey from the 80s up to 2000, you touched on it a bit, but that that story of what those women went through to get to the Olympic level is one that I think has been told a little bit, but 6, 8 people to a room, piled into a van, paying their own way, it's come a very long way.
Yes, absolutely. Those players deserve lots of credit for keeping us up there and passing on the torch.
Kyle, this was excellent. Really appreciate you taking the time. Again, if you want to get a hold of Kyle's book, which I really recommend, Sydney's Silver Lining, on his website, sydneysilverlining.com, amazon.com as well. And hopefully we'll get those numbers up and we'll get some more people to learn about this great story.
All right. Hope everyone stays safe and well, and we'll be in the pool soon.